Well, Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're probably wondering what you've done now. Let
Yeah,
yourself in for,
definitely,
but
definitely.
great to have you. So, just for those of you that don't know, Jonathan is the CEO for St. Paul's Hospice, and he's ex-military, so graduated from Sandhurst and was in the army for something like 30 years, and obviously is as part of that has worked, I think, with a lot of really impressive people. But in terms of St. Paul's, in 2014, he helped them through a restructuring program, and because they had some huge funding cuts, and they had to really think about how they remodeled the services. So, I think it ties in quite nicely with the theme that we have around this month as well, which is around the power of small change. So that's the theme for this month generally that we're doing across our smart boards and Scale Up Club and all of the people that we work with. So I think it ties in really nicely with that. So, Jonathan, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to our select group.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a fascinating. I'm really interested, Pete, in podcasts. It's now on my list to talk to my team about tomorrow, because I think it's another channel that we might explore here at St. Paul's. St. Paul's Hospice, Hostel. Sorry, it's a hostel, not hospice. We were founded in I caught the boat. We were founded in 1977. Back then, and our website has some pictures. Quite rough and ready, probably not compliant with current health and safety regulations, I guess. Where it was a very, very turn up, get fed, sleep, leave, very, very rough and ready. We're now honed as a charity. We've been around for 40 odd years. We have trustees, excellent trustees, I will say, and we employ about 25 people plus or minus on a number of things. The sorts of things we do. Well, if you've been in Worcester, you will probably know where the hostel is. It's on top of Tower Hill, next to the mosque. That's a good relationship, as it happens. We have 46 people, pretty much any one time, in this building. We also run houses that we call move on or resettlement accommodation. We are also privileged, I think, to be running the first county Housing First project, which is an internationally recognised approach to dealing and helping people who are most entrenched, rough sleepers, to rehouse. And we also use catering as a tool to re-enable, and our whole ethos, I'll come to in the second half of my talk, is around this lens of trauma, which is a word we all now know and understand, I think, but it's what's happened to someone in their life, not what's wrong with them. And we'll come to that. And it was the thing that changed me the most. So that's St. Paul's. I am a former soldier. I did 30 years. Yes, I went to Sandhurst and didn't walk on the grass and got shouted at and all those things. I left as a colonel. I left in 2012, and I covered such exciting jobs in my last year as organising the Freedom of Worcester Parade for 3 regiments in April of that year. The only thing that couldn't be decided very easily was what form of uniform they were all to wear, because they all came differently. I planned the West Midlands response to the fuel drivers' strike. If you remember, back in 2012, the strike was about to happen, and I was so disappointed it never happened, because we'd put a lot of work into that. And my last kind of job really was to look after the planning to the West Midlands Olympics in 2012, and then I retired in 2012, and I joined St. Paul's in the autumn of the following year, in 2013. Never expected, after leaving the military, to do something like this. And Pete, I'm with you. I wanted to do something completely different, and I found myself in that role, and it is so much liberating, and I thoroughly enjoy the role. So let me talk about the small change that I'd ask you to listen to and perhaps ask you to undertake. And the small change is how you think about a problem. Thinking differently about the problem that you face in front of you. And that's something that I had to do when I arrived back in the autumn of 2013. The way that we frame our understanding of something, the models of thinking, the untested assumptions that we bring to that thinking, our own personal biases, that is really important to question and think about. And I was faced in the early part of 2014, having arrived at St. Paul's, facing a 40% budget cut in year. And that was because our funding had largely come from central government, as many charities had at that time. It was a Labour Party initiative, goes back to 2002. And I had to rethink what we were going to do and kind of survive those cuts and think about things very, very differently. And I was able to do that through using a different way of looking at homelessness. And I hope that's something that I can leave with you today. I've got a short video to show you. So 30 years in the British Army does teach you a few things. And it's certainly one of the things that the Army does teach you is a process by which to look at a problem, pull it apart, examine it, and put a plan together. I've never come across a process that's bettered. It's very thorough. It's incredibly simple in many ways, but it leaves you with a very straightforward ability to plan and have a mission-orientated outcome, if you will, to think about the ends and what is it you're trying to achieve. So I came to the job with that, not much else, I think. But having found myself through the recruiting process, I found myself very quickly, probably the first 6 months, in a place where I thought, I'm not really sure what I'm being asked to do, or indeed, I'm not really sure what this organisation is trying to do. And I had no background in this world at all. And I found myself being told by the people that work for me, homelessness is caused predominantly by three things. And you will hear these three things over and over again. Relationship breakdown, that's what people say causes homelessness. They will also say they lose their property, or often a private rented house or flat. Landlord asks them to leave for some reason, or somehow they've lost their income and can't afford to sustain their mortgage. And those three things were and are the things that people say creates homelessness. And of course, I used to think to myself, yeah, but that happens to loads of people and they don't end up coming to St. Paul's Hostel. So why is that? And I kept asking this question, but why? Why doesn't that happen to the friend of mine that lost his job after he split up with his fourth or fifth wife? He didn't end up in a place like this. He didn't end up suffering from addiction. And the other thing I noticed when I arrived, that there were some real contradictions in what I will call the cultural architecture, the kind of noticeable things around an organisation which signal things, tell you things. So on one hand, we had a rather maternalistic approach to looking after the people that we try and help. But at the same time, we claimed to be non-interventionist. We had a poster in our foyer that said, "We do not interfere in people's lives." And I used to say, so what do we do then? What are we all here for? What is our purpose? And in some respects, we had become going towards infantilization. We had chairs in our dining room which were plastic, different colours, the sort of adult versions of the ones that you'd find in a primary school. So there are these cultural contradictions, and I couldn't figure out what it was we were trying to do. And if I were to talk in army speak, I'd say we lacked a kind of common doctrine, an common understanding of what we were all trying to do. So that's where I started, and I was very lucky to meet a gentleman who runs a school in Redditch, actually. Who's from Redditch? Is it Peter or Helen? Well, one of you's from Redditch, isn't it? Andy, thank you. And his name is Sean Williams, and Sean Williams is the head teacher at a school in Eastmoor Road called The Forge. And the Forge is a school for children 11 to 16 who have been excluded or partially excluded from mainstream education. And I came across Sean quite by accident, and I probably been in the job about 9 months, and I said to him, I tell you what, I've done many complicated things in my army career, but I cannot work out what this is we're dealing with. this thing we call homelessness. And Sean looked at me and he said, I know what it is. You're dealing with the adult version of what I'm dealing with at schools, and that's children who have suffered, endured adversity in their childhood, and that has left them with a way of coping in a certain way. It's changed their brain biology, their brain connections, and has left them responding to situations to survive. So it's adaptive behavior, but it's worked for them. And I thought, yeah, that's it. That is it. Because when I talk to residents back then, I would ask them about where they're from and what they did and how they came here. And it became evident that I could almost predict the answer to the question that they would produce. They would say, yes, mum and dad were divorced, but then they would add, and mum's new boyfriend hated me. Or my mum and dad were in some way unable to love me. They were drinkers, they were addicts to drugs. And the stories came very, very similar. And I heard what Sean Williams said, and I thought, yeah, that's it, that is it. Of course. So I got to understand this world called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs. Now this is something that has been around since the mid-90s, and I'll show you a video in a moment which explains it far better than I ever will. But it's something that I think we intrinsically all know, but the science is really now demonstrating that this kind of stuff has an impact on a person's neurology and the way they think and the way they respond and behave. So I'm going to play this video, if I may. It's just 5 minutes long. So here we go.
Mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up. Are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, for individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation,
so there you go.
Please visit.
The small thing is to think about this phenomenon we call homelessness differently. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that everybody who becomes homeless has had a high degree of childhood adversities, but what we know from working here at St. Paul's is that those people who are multi-excluded homeless, those people who homelessness is almost a thing that is around their life, they're in and out of institutions or homeless hostels, and they have a long-term difficulty with some form of addiction or making them relationships. That is at the heart of it, for sure. And that's been the change in the lens that I brought into St. Paul's, which provided what was missing, this underlying understanding and doctrine for the team through which to understand and therefore help in a considered and consistent way. So that's the really big change. Just to say, the Folletti and Anders study in the United States didn't start out quite as they said on the video. They actually started out as a weight loss study, and they were trying to figure out why it was that some people who were losing weight really well then stopped coming and didn't continue with the program. And there was some discussions and interviews, and the doctors discovered there was something else going on beneath the surface, and these adversities were unearthed. And that's how it started. So it was back to asking the right questions. What's going on here, really, behind it? To say, here at St. Paul's, we undertake ACE screening. We have our own counsellor, and the average number of ACEs here at St. Paul's is 8 out of 10. So we have a very high level of this adversity, often in early life, and therefore there is not a correlation, but a dependence to a high level of drug and alcohol addiction. And that's the lens, and that's the idea and the understanding I want you to take away from this. And when you read in the local newspaper that the girl who is on her 4th trip to the magistrates because she's taking cocaine, or someone has stolen something from a shop because they have a drug addiction, the question to always ask, and of course the papers don't tell you, is what's gone on behind the story here? What happened to them? And you will find, and we know, though, people who we see in the newspapers have a backstory which is about abuse and neglect. And what I find really interesting as a former soldier is how society on the one hand is very sympathetic to soldiers who have post-traumatic stress disorder from operational deployment, something that they volunteer to do and they're trained to deal with in tough situations. Yet society isn't helpful or very sympathetic towards people who are homeless and who have addictions. But actually, if they knew that this happened to them when they were kids, that's a contradiction, I think, that we've yet to reconcile as a society. This is happening to children. There will be people who are yet unborn, who are unborn, that will end up in places like St. Paul's who need help, and indeed end up in places like the Forge in Redditch, excluded from normal provision. So let's now talk about some little things I did, and then I'll open up the questions if that's okay with you, Kevin. The first thing that we did, once we had understood what we were dealing with, is we did some training, and we invested in training with the University of Worcester, and we got ourselves alongside a fantastic lecturer across there called Derek, and he is one of the world experts in brain biology. He's a psychologist and he understands this world. So we co-developed a course with him where we put all our staff through a 3-day course at the University of Worcester, where they understood how the brain operates, the role of the amygdala, the development stages, on all those aspects of how and what happens when the cycle of development, the growth of development is interrupted. The second thing we did was, and this is very much from my military experience, is to empower people. The importance of giving your frontline people the most flexibility that they possibly can. So tell them what you want them to do, not tell them how to do it, is the important mantra. What military call mission command, the Prussians call it Auftragtaktik, but it's empowerment in business speak. Telling people what it is, the impact, the effect you want, but not the how. Leave that for them to work out with the resources you give them. Because we had a culture of rules and many policies that tried to regulate behaviour of people who sometimes found it difficult to regulate their behaviour. And that was not only the people that lived here, it's the staff. So we couldn't operate with a lot of rules. So we now have a way of talking about we operate in this area that's grey. Yes, there are boundaries, there must be, particularly around substance consumption and legislation, but there's quite a lot of flexibility that allows staff to operate in the middle, and that's the grey area that we had to coach them, reinforce how to work in this grey area, so they didn't need to ask me or my leadership team every time. They were able to understand the limits of what they can do and allow them as much freedom and flexibility as possible. So we also invested in some physical improvements. It's fair to say that I would be embarrassed now if I were to show people around how the hostel was back in 2013. It was not well painted. People didn't respect it. And there was this culture that my staff kept telling me that don't bother with painting, Jonathan, or putting a new door on, because they, meaning the people that we're trying to help, will not look after it and they will break it. So don't bother, you're wasting your time, it's a waste of money. I didn't believe it. I don't think humans operate like that. And I spent some money in investing in our garden, which was frankly horrible when we first arrived. And we created a therapeutic garden with benches, with a place for people to sit, with a water feature, with planters, all done by a fantastic gardener from Malvern called Christian Dowell, who's from the Dowell dynasty, and his brother wins, I think, the prize at Malvern every year. It's been open for the last 5, part of the big family. And Christian came and did that for us, and he used some of the residents to help. And I can tell you now, it's been now there for 4 years, 3 years, 3.5 years. It hasn't been trash. Yes, there's been the odd dandelion that's been broken, and there's been the odd plate that's been smashed, but the garden is respected. And indeed, what is really heartening is that the residents police it themselves. So we invested in developments of the garden, and following that, we created our own vegetable garden, which allows us to cook some fresh stuff and for people to go out and do that rather therapeutic. And so we invested in making the place feel better. So when you arrive, there are flowers in the reception. Small things matter. There are posters that don't say we don't intervene. There are posters that say this is what we can do to help you. We have, and the fourth thing we did, there's 2 more things. We invested in time to set up a co-production method so that those that we're helping were involved in the generation of the development of the services. What you would do with your customers, I hope, to understand what they want. And that's what we did. So we were doing with, not doing to. It's a very easy habit to get into, I think. And one final thing was I recruited the right team. There were people that couldn't adopt this new way of thinking. There was this new way of looking at the problem, that perhaps wanted to be that prison guard in disguise, that wanted to not give their minds to help someone be better. And they left and they couldn't work with it. I didn't have to dismissed them. They just couldn't cope with it and left. So I was able to recruit new people. So that together, the new lens, the problem of budget, created an opportunity. In retrospect, it was a blessing in disguise. I'm going to pause there, just take questions, and I'm going to finish off by just asking you to think about a few things and anything you might do as citizens that might help solve this problem. So there we are. I'll wait for questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Really good, and certainly made me think, and definitely some real common links to business as well there. So any questions? Who'd like to ask a question? Joe.
I was going to say, out of interest, obviously you say you've got 46 residents. How many people does that leave on the streets in Worcester? And when you see people on the streets during the daytime begging, are they your residents coming back out?
Yeah, it's a good question. Good questions, Joe. Let me try and help this. So the first thing I would ask is that think of homelessness as an iceberg. Rough sleeping is the top bit that sticks out the top, but it's the small bit. And beneath the iceberg, there is what often called hidden homeless, of which people in hostels are legally not homeless. They are still homeless. This is temporary accommodation. And that number is much larger. So by way of example, typically once a year, the government conduct a rough sleeper count, which is not a particularly easy thing to do, but they might say there are 4,500 people sleeping rough. That will be your headlines in about February every year. But there are around 220,000 people below the line who are not counted, including people who are sofa surfing, including people who live in a temporary accommodation like hostels, including people who are living in bed and breakfasts, including people sleeping in the back of their car or in someone else's shed. So the government might focus on that very top bit, as you do, but that's a small part of the problem. The second question about begging, this is contentious ground, and I'm clear where we stand in Worcester. They're not people from St. Paul's Hostel will go out and begging. Occasionally, someone might go out and beg. Let's just firstly understand what begging's about. Begging, whether aggressive or not, and I know that Worcester News have run a story today about the new signs. We know that people who beg on the streets aren't begging for the things that they ask you for. They won't be spending that money on a bed and breakfast. They won't be spending that on food. They will be spending that on Class A drugs. That is what they'll be spending on. And that's not to demonize them. They need help. They're addicts. They're using drugs often to mask, to anesthetize those early life experiences, that shame that still perpetuates. But giving them a tenner won't help, because all they'll do is go to the local dealer, and the local dealer will then get it off the next guy. And what we'll have in the city is county lines. We'll have an influx of drugs coming in from big cities. It happens now. So I would say don't do that. And though it's difficult, because you're looking someone in the eye who is going to manipulate you to feel sorry for them, but say, no, look, that's not going to help you. There are free food kitchens every night in Worcester. They operate out of Salvation Army, Trinity Street, and the Worcester Arts Workshop. Every night, for free, people can eat. There is no need to be hungry. And there is also help available to find accommodation. So in terms of your last question, how many does that leave? Well, the first thing it's worth remembering is that rough sleeping and homelessness isn't a static figure. People come onto the streets and off the streets. There's a flow all the time. But typically in Worcester, Worcestershire, we would have a count of around 45. However, we should compare that to the figure that were brought in under the Everybody In campaign last year, when the government just ignored its own bureaucracy and got everybody into accommodation, which was 153 or 154. So 3 times the number. Now, that's not to say there were 3 times the number of people rough sleeping, but they were on the edges of it, perhaps sofa surfing, perhaps in a place that they couldn't sustain in the pandemic. So you can see the problem that the government look at, this rough sleeper bit at the top of the iceberg, is a small and difficult part, but it's not the whole. And I would add, you won't solve homelessness by just concentrating on rough sleeping, because many people their first experience of homelessness isn't rough sleeping, it's sofa surfing or being in a hostel or being in someone else's flat or a car. And the things that solve homelessness are structural, affordable housing being one of them. So how does that, was that a full answer?
Yeah, that was really clear. Yeah, and it was, and I found it was amazing, you know, how when the effort was made, so many people could be brought in last year. You know, it's, if the determination is there, it is possible.
Political will, political way, isn't it?
And you know, and read stories about how so many of those have been helped to get into properties, and all the, you know, the facilities were put there to help them, and it was marvelous, to be honest. So
yeah, but Joe, we, the public, the voter, have acknowledged this, because it's government policy choices at the heart of it that make changes to benefits, to the welfare state, to childhood education, to the type of housing that's, you know, being built, or the government subsidies around housing. So these are sad, obviously political choices that governments of different colours take. It's fair to say in the 2000s and the 90s, rough sleeping went down under the administration that was in then, in the 2000s, but other forms of homelessness went up. So the hostels were more full. There was more people in emergency accommodation. So the iceberg was just pressed below the waterline a bit more, and that's often not acknowledged by some commentators, but it is the case when we look at the stats.
very interesting. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions?
My husband will be glad to hear what you said about don't give them money, they'll spend it on drugs, because I always give them money and he always tells me off because he says, I don't know why you're doing that, they'll spend it on drugs. So I'll stop now, because I'm one that will not be able to resist some sad person's eyes looking at me. I'm interested in what do you do to help them get out of homelessness? So they can come to the hostel. Do they have a limited time they can stay there, and what funding do you get, or what help do you get to move them into proper accommodation, and what kind of is the success rate for that, if there is one?
Yeah, good questions, Helen. So now we look at the problem through the eyes of the lens of trauma and childhood adversity. We recognise that the answers are mostly to change what's going up in here with someone. And in order to do that, there are tools that we have. So we have our own very, very experienced counsellor who was a drug and alcohol support worker before. We use therapeutic interventions. So we and the staff practice mindfulness. We have our own mindfulness coach who's our finance officer. She does that as well. We use the power of group work. So our counsellor or our staff will have people in what you would perhaps understand as an Alcoholics Anonymous kind of group where people talk about their experiences. We focus our staff on building relationships with people so they trust, because it's through relationships that people actually change. You can't make someone, can't make someone change by punishing them. So you have to work with them, and that is the tough bit for staff now. Because rather than just turn up to work and press the button, let people out and sort of police the place, they now are expected to actually engage in this relational building and understand about people, how it makes them change, and coach and mentor and prompt and challenge, but do so from a position of kind of emotional safety themselves, that they can have conversations about, well, let's try and talk about why you need to smoke mamba. What's the feelings that's overcoming, and work with people. When I arrived, we were funded by government, as I said, and with that came, you can imagine, a whole showed of paperwork which stopped you doing the job that they were asking you to do. As governments do this, they're brilliant, aren't they? And it did say in that paperwork somewhere that people shouldn't stay in places like this for anything longer than 6 months. But once you understand brain biology and the neurology of what's happening to people's cognitive connections, it takes more than 6 months sometimes to help people to think differently, to have that kind of emotional resilience. So we don't have a time limit. What we have is a principle, and the principle is betterment. And that means if where the person is going is not better for them than here, they can stay here till we can find a place, because what we don't want to happen is they go into a place where they're perhaps mixing with people that we wouldn't rather they didn't. Back come the habits, back come the behaviours, and round the circle they will go. Success is hard. It is hard. I will say this. Any homeless charity that tells you that they're 97% effective is either dealing with not homeless people or people who are not deeply difficult to deal with. We are fortunate to be able to work with other charities in the city, Worcester Community Trust. They have a great job coach scheme. We work with the DWP to get people back into work. But I will say to you that the majority of people that end up in this deeply traumatized, socially isolated way that we're dealing with are a long way from the job market, a long way. And they have to recover before they can even think about that. So if we get 4 or 5 people into jobs in a year, we are doing well.
Oh, yeah. But those 4 or 5, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Andy, I think you had a question.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was just interested. Where do you, as a result of COVID and lockdown, where do you think the homelessness situation will be in 2 years' time, say?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. I think we're at a crossroads. It depends on what the economics play out, doesn't it? I think, and you'll all be watching that with a keen eye, how much more intervention the state will, how much of our tax-paying money they will throw at the problem. The predictions are not as bad as they were a year ago. The predictions are now that unemployment is not going to be as harsh as perhaps it was first thought. I think what we will see, the council, the local authority or district councils will see, and they have been seeing, is a rise in the number of people that are coming to them for help. But they have more tools in their quivers, or arrows in their quivers, to prevent someone from losing their house in the first place, whether that's through paying some of their rent or arranging something that keeps them there. Because homeless prevention, of course, is better than cure. Will we see a rise in rough sleeping, which is it's only the visible bit? I think we will. And the reason I think we will is that the likes of the Founds Hotel and the other emergency accommodation settings that have been procured will want to go back to being what they were. And the challenge the local authority has, and this is a challenge which is not their fault. This is a manifestation of house building policy, economics, government policy. They struggle to find affordable, high quality accommodation with the right support workers to keep people there. That's what they will struggle to find. So I think we will see an uptick in rough sleeping, certainly in Worcester, where it has 60% of the county's problem, over the next after the summer into the autumn. That will be my most pessimistic assessment. I think that's where we'll see, and that's because there just is not the quantity of good quality accommodation that we need to put people in, because you know as well as I do, governments have slashed local authority budgets, and that's not helped. And of course, there's been a contraction in funding for mental health services and the like. So it's going to be a difficult time for us, I think, in 2020, 2021. Demand is going up and funding is going down. So that to answer your last point, Helen, about funding, so we do claim government benefits to keep people here. It's their benefit. We claim it on their behalf, so they don't spend it on things they shouldn't. But that really, if you've been a school governor, you know how the school budget works. The government pay for the basics, and the Parents Teachers Association pay for all the other bits. And it's the same for homeless charities. So about 60% of our funding is covered core to keep the building upright and service most of the staff, but they don't pay for things like counselling. They don't pay for our kitchen assistant training program. They don't pay for the food that is eaten. They don't pay for the experiential things that people do. We pay for people to go to do an educational course or go somewhere with someone to have an experience. They don't pay for any of that.
Is there this understanding of this and preventable? Is there a deep understanding of this in national government and things being reviewed and looked at? Am I getting a bit deep here? You know, is there any sympathy, or is anybody looking into how this can be helped in childhood? It's probably a bit too far ranging for you to answer, but you just kind of look at that video and you think, why isn't more being done to help the children? Or is that just too simple?
No, I think it is. I think homeless prevention starts in the third trimester of birth, in the first 1,000 days. People like Marmot, Professor Marmot, who did his review in 2010 about what makes people healthy and ill, he said this, and he said it in 2020 when he wrote his 10-year report that said you haven't done anything in the last 10 years. So people who are in education, people who are in children's services know this stuff now, and the language is there. If you talk to our own county council, they know this stuff. Government know this stuff. They have advisors, they know this stuff. The officers in government know this stuff. Are we seeing that upstream investment in children's services? No. Because there is a limited tax take, isn't there? And choices have to be made, and we shouldn't be taking all the money that my dad and my brother and you all earn as taxes. We have to be guarded against how much we take off the taxpayer. There is an understanding of it. Sure, we've advocated the ACE approach for about 6 years now, and it's kind of caught the attention, and other people are following in the same way. I have to say, go to Scotland, miles ahead. They are an ACE-aware nation. They have one health service that covers all of Scotland, not several. They are ACE-aware, and they have developed a national framework of training for various services to use, so that the language and the skill sets of the practitioners is similar. So Scotland miles ahead, and we should take a leaf out of the jocks.
All right, good. And I think you have one or two. Just want to be respectful of everybody's time. I think you had some things you wanted to ask us to think about, Jonathan. You said
thank you. So the first thing is this model in your minds that's probably been there for some time. Small thing, change the model. Homeless people are not feckless and there by their own fault. That's the narrative. That's not the case. This goes back a lot further. Poverty, childhood adversity, parents who couldn't love, won't love, reject it. So that's the first thing. Second, ask yourself the question when you read in the Worcester News about the person that's being portrayed in a feckless way, actually what happened to them? What's the backstory here? Because they probably weren't born like that. They weren't born an alcoholic or a drug taker. Third, if you employ people, please try and employ young people. People need jobs and it's difficult. This is difficult to invest the time to nurture and coach a young person. It takes time. I have a 20-year-old son, and I know how difficult that can be, putting time aside. But investing in the youth so they become grounded adults that become tax-paying citizens is what we need, isn't it? There's no doubt about it. Lobby your local MP. Most of the levers that we need to pull are not local, they're national. National government owns the big levers of power: welfare policy, housing policy, health, education policies. These are national levers that the likes of Robin Worker and the other MPs can lobby for. They're not the business of Adrian Gregson or Mark Bayliss in Worcester. They have very little sway. And I think the last question I'd sort of leave you with is to take away this idea of trauma is often the thing that's at the heart of the difficulties, whether it's from childhood, whether it's happened through adolescence, or indeed in early adulthood. This is the damaging thing that can create changes in people's minds and their behaviours, which result in what people say is bad choices, but they're often not bad choices from the perspective of the person that's making about survival and how they're coping with that situation that's in front of them. So think of it through this lens of trauma and ask that question, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. I think that's where I'll leave it. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Really, yeah, fantastic session. And yeah, if we could show our, have you got that applause again, Pete? Do you want to play your applause again? We could.
There it is. Sorry.
There it is.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
I'll sign out. I'd just like to go back where I started and say, look, every aberration for small business owners in Great Britain, you're doing great stuff, and I'm sure it's tough sometimes, but without you, we're all stuffed. So keep working.
Thank you. And I think it's really what we love about these sessions is it's we try and make sure it's not all about business. That we bring in people like yourselves with a different perspective. But it's really interesting how there's always parallels back to business, and we had that we've had that a couple of times now, and we had somebody on who did the arch to arc event, and they had a record-breaking attempt as a team, and there were so many business lessons from that, and you've brought across a lot of things here, and you started essentially with that lens on the world, the paradigm shift in a way. We've all got our hidden biases, and starting and understanding that, and sometimes it just takes something to make us look at a problem in a different way, see it from a different light, I think is really key. And those 6 things that you talked about as well, empowering people, but in order to empower people, we've got to give them the training and the skills to be able to be empowered and within that paradigm that we're setting them, but also the importance of things like, I think, the physical changes that you talked about. Sometimes that environment that we've got people in can either be supportive of what we're trying to do or detrimental to it as well. And then that idea of co-production, of not just thinking, right, this is the theory, or this is what I think is the way we should do it, but actually working with people to really, whether that's our customers or whatever. And then of course the right team, making sure we've recruited the right team. So some really, those lessons go across anything that we're trying to achieve, I think, and certainly in business is really good takeaways for us. So thank you very much for all of that, Jonathan. Really excellent session. So thank you.
Thank you again. So in my military, permission to fall out.
Indeed, granted. Fall out. Thanks very much, Jonathan.
Thanks so much. Good to meet you all, and good luck.
Take care. Brilliant.